You're listening to Below the Surface, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Campus Killings, and Killer Communications. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
A missing person, a strange death, a vanished vehicle, a series of unanswerable questions. In so many true crime mysteries, the answers remain elusive. But in many instances, the clues lead right to the water's edge, and sometimes the truth lies below the surface. Welcome back to Below the Surface. I'm your host, Olivia, and today I'm unpacking the infamous case of Susan Smith. Many of our listeners may be familiar with this case and made headlines across the US and even internationally in the early 90s. But as with all cases, the deeper you dive, the more you find, and I hope today's episode uncovers new information for our listeners. Let's dive in. On the mild autumn evening of October 25th, 1994, Shirley and Rick McLeod were relaxing in their home near John D. Long Lake in Union, South Carolina. But at around 9 p.m, they heard a sudden commotion on their front porch. A young woman had run up the front stairs, wringing her hands, and she was hysterically sobbing. As Shirley opened the front door, the woman shouted, "Please help me. He's got my kids and he's got my car. A black man has got my kids and my car." The woman fell into Shirley's arms, her speech barely decipherable between her wails and her tears. Shirley hugged her tightly as Rick called 911. The woman's name was Susan Smith, and she was a young mother from the town of Union, which was around 11 miles from the Lake District. She'd gone to the Walmart she'd told Shirley, and when she got to the red light at Union's downtown, a black man had jumped into her car, put a gun into her side, and demanded that she drive. When they passed the sign for John D. Long Lake, the carjacker put the gun back into her side and told her that she didn't have time to get her 2 toddler boys out of the car, she just had to get out. He told her that he wouldn't hurt her kids, but he needed the car, she had to get out or he would shoot her. Susan said she got out afraid for her life, and he'd driven off into the night with 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex strapped into their car seats in the backseat of the vehicle. She'd run to the nearest house, which was the McLeod's house, and she was desperate for help. The sheriff's department arrived almost immediately, and Susan told her story to police. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, mobilised searches of the surrounding area with helicopters and divers, and they searched the lake where Susan claimed to have been forced from her vehicle. Shirley and Rick even joined the searches. They were desperate to help reunite Susan with her babies. But nothing turned up, and as the desperation rose to bring Michael and Alex home, the story caught the attention of the Adam Walsh Center. Created by America's Most Wanted's John Walsh after his 8-year-old son Adam was abducted from a shopping mall in Florida in 1981, the Adam Walsh Center fiercely advocated for missing children and assisted families whose children were missing by providing media attention and information distribution. Representatives arrived at Susan Smith's home to give her a platform to appeal to the public for help. On October 26th, only one day after the children's abduction, Susan and her husband David made a public plea on TV, begging whoever had taken the children to bring them home. But even as their video was released, police were beginning to suspect that something about this case did not add up. In Susan's initial police interview following the 911 call, she had told police that she had gone to the Walmart and then to visit a friend, and that she had been intercepted at the stoplight on her way to his house. She also said she'd been the only car at the stoplight. No one else had been around but the carjacker. But investigators immediately found inconsistencies when they tried to corroborate her story. They were unable to find any eyewitnesses at the Walmart who remembered seeing Susan and her 2 children that night. When detectives talked with Susan's friend, he claimed he'd never had a visit planned with Susan. On top of this, the stoplight she was carjacked at was not a red stoplight. It was permanently green unless triggered by other cars in the intersection, meaning there would have been no reason for her to stop at the light to give anyone the opportunity to get into her car. When investigators asked her about her background, Susan explained that while she was still legally married to her children's father, David, the two were in the throes of a divorce. And Susan said that she was in a committed and happy relationship with a man named Tom Finlay. However, when police questioned Tom, he reported he'd ended his relationship with Susan just days before the alleged carjacking. He told police that he really liked Susan, but that he didn't want the responsibility of raising another man's children. If Susan had lied about all of these things, could she also be lying about her children's abduction? On October 27th, in a standard operating procedure for the investigation, detectives admitted polygraph tests to Susan and to David. And while David passed, Susan's test was inconclusive, specifically showing levels of deception when she was asked if she knew where her children were. So, in a second interview, investigators asked her outright if she had killed her boys because Tom had broken up with her over their existence. Susan adamantly denied that she'd killed her children for any reason. She said that someone had taken them and she wanted them back. But by day 4, there had been no sign of Susan's Mazda protege or the boys, despite the national be on the lookout put out for her car and the boys' descriptions. Though on October 30th, police received a public tip that took some of the pressure off of Susan. A young child had been abandoned by a male driver in a hotel parking lot in Seattle. The car had South Carolina license plate and the child matched Alex Smith's description. Perhaps Susan had told the truth and at least one of her sons would be reunited with her. But the boy in question turned out to not be Alex and the car was not Susan's. The eye of the law quickly swung back to Susan, especially since her claims that a random black man had abducted her children ignited racial tension throughout the town of Union. Susan's stepfather, Bev Russell, was the nephew of a prominent South Carolina senator, and though Susan reportedly didn't benefit much from Bev's wealth or fame, her claims exacerbated already tense relations in the town about prominent white citizens blaming any and all violent crimes on black citizens. And sheriff's officers, particularly the lead case detective Howard Wells, suspected that's exactly what Susan had done. She concocted a nameless, violent black man to cover up her own violent crimes. Sheriff Wells just had to get her to admit it. So for 8 straight days, he had Susan come down to the police station and repeatedly asked her what had happened to her boys. And each day, her story about the unidentified black man became more and more vague. On November 2nd, 9 days after the Smith boys had disappeared, Sheriff Wells called Susan and asked her to meet him at the First Baptist Church near the police station. He could see the stress of the constant interviews both from the media and law enforcement were wearing her down, and he hoped that she would finally tell the truth as they sat together in the church's sanctuary. He took her hands and softly told her that they both knew that she was lying and it was time to finally come clean, and that she knew where her boys were. To the sheriff's great surprise, his gentleness seemed to finally crack Susan's facade. She said she did know where they were. They were in their car seats, dead at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. But she wanted him to know that she hadn't intended to kill them. She just felt like an awful mother. Her marriage to David had never been happy, and then her boyfriend had dumped her because she had children. She was alone, depressed, and isolated. She said that she'd tried to kill herself twice before, once at age 13 and once again at 18. Her stepfather had repeatedly raped her throughout her childhood and she'd lost her sense of self a long time ago. And now she was a divorced 23-year-old with 2 small children whose boyfriend had sent her a Dear John letter to break up with her. Wells asked her to elaborate what had really happened. Susan answered that a few days before she drowned her children, she'd gotten the letter from Tom. In it, he told her very plainly that he was breaking up with her because she had children and that he didn't want to be involved with a woman who had kids. It was devastating because she and Tom were in love and it was made all the worse because they worked together. She tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. On October 25th, she was feeling depressed and lonely. She picked the children up from daycare and asked a friend to drive her to Tom's office. She couldn't accept his breakup. She loved him and he loved her, and she wanted to make it work. So she left her children with a friend and went to say her piece. She thought she could convince Tom it would work out. But he was adamant. He didn't want to be a father to her children, there was no future for them, and he wished her well. When she came back out to the car, she told her friend that she no longer wanted to live. Her friend told her that she was just sad because of the breakup, but Susan said the feeling was too strong to just be sadness. She went home, packed a diaper bag for the boys, and tried going to her mother's house to tell her what had happened, but her mother wasn't home. She was at one of her other grandchildren's baseball games. This was yet another person who wasn't there for Susan in her time of need. Susan wanted to die, but she also couldn't leave her boys without a mother. She thought it would be better if they all died together. So she'd driven aimlessly along the highway until she'd seen the sign for the lake. She'd driven her car down the boat ramp and into the water, but right before it went in, she stopped and got out. She let the car free roll into the lake while the boys slept in the back seat. She said she watched in kind of a trance as the Mazda floated for a few minutes, but then black water filled the cabin, drowning her children inside the car as it slipped below the surface. Within seconds of the car disappearing, the weight of what she'd done crashed down, and she ran to the first house that she could find. She had an alibi forming as she ran since she knew she couldn't take back what she'd done. She provided the sheriff with the exact location of the boat launch, and while divers were dispatched to recover the bodies of her toddlers, Susan was arrested on 2 counts of murder. Susan Smith was held without bail and she faced the death penalty. South Carolina law stated that in cases where there were multiple homicides on juveniles, the death penalty was an applicable sentence. In preparation, her mother and her stepfather used his political influence to hire an attorney who specialised in death penalty cases. While her attorney team worked up a defence, Susan was held on suicide watch in prison. She was also diagnosed with depression and she required a psychiatric evaluation to make sure that she was competent to stand trial. This evaluation took 8 months, and in the end she passed competency and her trial began on a hot July day in 1995. The media storm that had begun the first day Susan and David had sat with the Adam Walsh Foundation turned into a cyclone on the day of the trial. Headlines claiming baby killer, killer mum, and the most hated woman in America caused the judge to ban all media from the courtroom for fear of influencing the jury. The state argued that Susan was a selfish, manipulative woman who realised the only way she'd get to keep her relationship with Tom was to get rid of her children, so she drowned them in the lake and blamed it on a phantom. The prosecution called Tom, Sheriff Wells, and several other investigators to testify against Susan. Tom's testimony more than supported the prosecution's theory. He said he had indeed sent Susan a breakup letter only days before her children had disappeared. In the letter, he wrote, "You will, without a doubt, make some lucky man a great wife, but unfortunately it won't be me. I could really fall for you. You have some endearing qualities about you, and I think you are a terrific person. But like I have told you before, there are some things that you aren't suited for me, and yes, I am speaking about your children." It was certainly emotive. Investigators testified about the inconsistencies in her stories as well as her confession. But the nail in Susan's coffin was testimony from the diver who had recovered her children's bodies. He told the jury how he'd swam up to the window of the vehicle and saw a tiny hand pressed against the glass. He'd let the other divers know he'd found the children before leaving the lake and sobbing on the bank. He had a little boy at home and the hand against the glass was too much for him to take. Because Susan had provided police with a written confession after she confessed to Sheriff Wells, the defence had only 2 options: pleading insanity, which they couldn't do because she'd been deemed competent to stand trial and she had not been diagnosed with schizophrenia, delusions or psychosis. Their only other option was to claim that Susan's actions were caused by her severe depression and suicidal ideations. Susan had a long history of mental health issues brought on by her own father's suicide when she was 6 and years of sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather. She had been suicidal in some or another way from the age of 10 and had tried to overdose on Tylenol at ages 13 and 18. Her failed marriage, coupled with the dissolvement of her relationship with Tom, had pushed her over the edge. The drownings were a failed suicide attempt in which she'd planned to drown herself alongside her sons. To prove this point, the defence called a psychiatrist to show how Susan's depression had escalated to suicidal proportions. He claimed that after several sessions with Susan, he believed that Susan had a dependent personality disorder in which she constantly needed affection and became terrified at the thought of being alone. He went on to explain that Susan felt such an extreme loneliness that at the time of the drownings, she was having a sexual relationship with David, though they were getting divorced, with Tom Finlay, and to the shock of the courtroom with her own stepfather, Bev Russell. It was part of a destructive pattern where Susan had sex with men because she wanted to be loved, and when Tom rejected her, the rejection made her suicidal. But when she was actually faced with the end of her own life, a self-preservation reflex kicked in and she couldn't go through with it, even though she'd already put the plan in motion for her children. The defence concluded that Susan was a damaged, depressed woman with a history of suicide attempts, and an appropriate conviction was one of manslaughter and not murder. But the jury found her guilty on 2 counts of murder in less than 3 hours. And with the death sentence on the table, the defence put several of Susan's family members on the stand to plead for leniency during the penalty phase. Susan's stepfather, Bev, publicly admitted that he had sexually assaulted Susan for years when she was a teenager, and that their sexual relationship had morphed into a consensual romantic one after she got married to David. Bev took full responsibility for his part in destroying Susan's mental health through his perverse actions, and he begged the judge to see her as a weak and mentally unstable woman, in part due to his abuse for so many years. Co-workers and friends also took the stand. They said that Susan had been a good mother to her boys and that she adored them. They said that she had made them her whole world, and even the pathologist had admitted in her testimony that the children had been extremely healthy and cared for right up to the minute that Susan pulled the parking brake off the vehicle. A doctor also took the stand, restating the diagnosis of Susan's depression and suicidal ideations due to her intense dependency. The prosecution started their penalty phase by showing clips of Susan's police interviews where she lied continuously about her son's disappearances. This was followed by testimony from several investigators and a rep from the Adam Walsh Foundation, who all commented on how disinterested Susan had acted in private when she spoke about finding her children, and that in several cases she'd been more concerned with how she looked in the press coverage. Lastly, David Smith took the stand. He broke down during his testimony several times and at one point was crying so uncontrollably that the judge had to call a recess. In his final statement to Susan, he said, "All my hopes, all my dreams, everything I had planned for the rest of my life ended. My life with my kids was gone." Susan was given a chance to address the jury, but she declined. And much to the prosecution's surprise, the jury returned with a unanimous decision to downgrade Susan's sentence from death to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. And that brings us to today. Susan is serving her time at the Leah Correctional Centre in Greenwood, South Carolina. She was eligible for her first parole hearing on November 20th, 2024. I'm sure our listeners will not be surprised that she was denied parole for several reasons. For one, Susan's time behind bars hasn't been without incident. She's been disciplined on multiple occasions for illicit drug use, as well as documented incidents of self-mutilation. She also gave a documentary producer private contact information for her ex-husband David and his family without his consent. Secondly, the parole board does not believe Susan has yet shown an appropriate amount of remorse. Her ex-husband told the parole board this wasn't a tragic mistake. She meant to end their lives, and I've never felt any remorse from her for it. The prosecutor who tried her case back in 1995 also told the parole board that he did not believe she had shown any remorse, remarking Susan has always focused on Susan. And this may be in response to the fact that Susan has spent her most recent years corresponding with potential suitors on the outside. According to reports, she has had many offers from men who want to care for her, and she's allegedly referred to one of these suitors as her boyfriend. One of her relatives said the following: "She's always been into guys. She's hoping to find the right man to live with if she gets out." This can be read as a person who's more interested in setting up their plan for the future than appropriately contemplating how they took 2 innocent lives. And lastly, the parole board took the severity of her crime into account, as well as victim impact statements. Susan had premeditated the drownings, then lied to cover her tracks in both police interviews and in public TV appearances. She purposely redirected investigative resources away from actually locating her children. David told the parole board that in his estimation, Michael and Alex didn't get a chance at life. They were forced the death penalty. And Susan has only served 15 years for each of his dead children. It's not enough time for what she did. Likewise, her actions destroyed his life, the life of his extended family as well. He lost his sons, and his parents and Susan's parents lost their grandchildren. David also cited that he struggled with intense depression even 30 years later. Some days he still can't get out of bed, and he has contemplated suicide on several occasions to end the grief. The parole board was unanimous in its decision to deny parole. But based on South Carolina law, Susan will now be eligible for parole every 2 years. David has publicly declared he will be present at every forthcoming parole hearing to make sure that Susan is never released. He has said it will be the last act he can do to ensure that his sons didn't die in vain. If Susan had made a different choice on the fateful night of October 25th, 1994, Michael Smith would currently be 34 and Alex Smith would be 32. But instead of living full lives and perhaps having families of their own, all that is left of them is a memorial bearing their names at the site where their mother watched them slip below the surface of John D. Long Lake's murky water. They are forever 3 and 14 months old, and we will never know who they might have become. As of the time of recording this podcast, Susan Smith has a year to contemplate her remorse before returning to the parole board. Do you think she will be paroled? Let us know in your comments and your reviews. A special thanks to Megan over at Woman and Crime Podcast for sharing her research on today's case. Sources for this episode include crimelibrary.org, murderpedia.com, people.com, thestate.com, WIFF4.com, ABC News, Fox News, Stacey Malcoat's book Woman, Gender and Crime, Maya and Oberman's book When Mothers Kill, Interviews from Prison. We'd love for you to follow us on social media. We're on every major platform, so search for us on your favourites, and we'll be sure to include links in the show notes. You can also find us on our website, belowthesurfacepodcast.net. If you'd like to show your support for this show and get your episodes early and ad-free, consider an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, not only will you get early and ad-free access to this show, but to every show on the AbJack network of shows. To get started, just head over to Apple Podcasts and search for the AbJack Entertainment channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Finally, we'd very much appreciate you leaving a rating or review on the platform you're listening to us now on. This will really help us grow, and it helps new listeners to find the show. And please tell your friends about Below the Surface. Nothing beats word of mouth. We will see you back in 2 weeks with an all-new episode. Thank you all so much.
Below the Surface is hosted and narrated by Olivia McKenzie, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro, and it's produced by Mike Morford for AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to join us for the next episode of Below the Surface.